guest this week is Brian Stack. Brian has been a late-night comedy writer and performer since 1997. First with Conan O'Brien for 18 years, and since 2015 at The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Before that, he performed in his hometown of Chicago at the Second City, where he worked with his wife Miriam Tolan and many others. He has also appeared in supporting roles in such shows as 30 Rock, Parks and Recreation, The Office, and New Girl. He's a self-described music nerd and appreciates the opportunity to geek out today with me about one of his all-time favorite songwriters. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome the Revolutions Per Movie, Brian Stack. Hi, Brian.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, you picked quite a heavy hitter. Be Here to Love Me, a film about Townes Van Zandt, done in 2004 by Margaret Brown. But then, at the same time, parallel to that, you're like one of the most mind-searing, long-running weirdo performers in late night ever, right? And I just love that you picked it. So this is my chance to ask you about stuff I've always wondered about late night. You've been in it so long. Has that changed in terms of the work ethic or what you are expected to do nowadays for late night?
Well, the Stephen's show, is obviously quite different from Conan's in many ways, in the sense that it's more monologue centric and deals more with the headlines and what's happening in politics and things like that. But in terms of the kind of people I've worked with, I've been lucky enough to work with incredibly nice people, Stephen and Conan both included. And so the vibe at both shows always felt this very similar in terms of the camaraderie and the collaboration and the sense of silliness. But just the subject matter has changed a bit, because I know at Conan we didn't deal directly with politics that much. We tended to deal more with silly characters and dressing up like a pirate or something and coming in, juggling salamis or something. But I love both shows and I love both hosts, and I'm grateful to have had them as my bosses because they are really great guys. I'd known Stephen going back to my Chicago days. My Chicago improv days where I started out, and I had always been one of his biggest fans. And Conan, as you know, everybody knows how brilliantly funny he is. And he was a great boss too. And getting to work with Conan for 18 years and now with Stephen for 9, I feel very, very lucky.
Right. I mean, just the other day you were posting about broadcast news and the scene of them running a 3/4 inch tape down the hall to get it there. I mean, is that energy still there today in terms of like sometimes an idea comes really late in the game of production?
Yeah, everything a lot of times feels very last second. We're working on the show right up until Stephen runs on stage, and it was very similar at Conan too. And in the broadcast news scene, unlike today where everything's digital and like the edits are all done at a split second digitally and stuff. When I was at Conan, I remember in the early days, there were those big 3/4 inch tapes that you would literally be running down the hall with, just like Joan Cusack does in broadcast news. And I got a kind of really a nice wave of nostalgia seeing that scene again. Because I do remember just seeing those tapes all the time and just rushing down and you had to feed tapes into a machine, in order to edit, as you know. And it's a different world today. It's much, much faster.
Did you ever have things just halted at the last minute? Because, I mean, I should say that when I played on Conan, God of My Voices are getting ready behind a curtain. But in the meantime, he's interviewing guests right across the space. And when we arrived, he was working really hard on the sketch that was going to be in between the main guest and the band. That got cut because Alec Baldwin went long. And I remember Conan being so bummed out that it went long. I heard him. Alec Baldwin was gone. He was like, God damn it. He's just like so pissed that the thing that was most important to him was the comedy. It was so incredible. So I just wonder like how it is to have to turn on a dime, and it's a very structured format, but it's got to be elastic at the same time, right?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. It's there is structure, but it's also you have to be prepared for things to go wrong and things to change at the last second. And a lot of times my favorite stuff was when things went off the rails and went wrong. Like And Conan liked to roll with that too. Like I remember once I was coming down the stairs dressed as God, and
Oh, I've seen that.
oh, you probably see it. It was in a blooper reel, but I'm clumsy to begin with, and in sandals, I'm completely hopeless. And so I slipped a little as I was coming down the stairs talking to Conan, and he just ad libbed, "God, have you been drinking?" And and a lot of times those are our favorite moments. Or when I would be doing Wiki Bear with him, one time I dropped the script fell off the script fell off the stand, and you could hear like shuffling papers, and so we ended up riffing around about that. And those were oftentimes my favorite moments when you could just the unexpected. And Conan comes from an improv background too, and a lot of times our favorite stuff is accidental. And if you treat there's an old saying in improv, if you treat mistakes as gifts, then the audience loves it, because if you just because they know something went wrong, and if you're having fun with it, it's like it can be a real joyful experience.
Yeah, and musicians have the knack to roll with things like that or not. I've been in bands in both situations where like you kind of go with the moment, something's gone wrong, and you roll with it, and it just rolls off your back, and you make fun of it. And then you have other people who are just mortified, and the show is like just the dynamic and the temperature on stage changes because something is not right, and their inability to roll with it. But one of the things I love about your characters, there's that one, I can't remember the character's name, the one who hat changes all the time, and like when you're doing the fashion reports.
Joe Galliano, yeah, it was a fictional brother of an actual designer named John Galliano who had gotten in trouble for controversial statements and things like that. So we had to do quick changes with the hats, and
Yes.
I owe Scott Cronick, our wardrobe designer, was the genius behind those hats, and we just told him to go nuts and make them as crazy as possible. And the quick changes were a lot of fun.
They're beautiful.
Thanks. Yeah, he did a great job.
They're beautiful. Also, like what happens when a piece like that is made? You can't undo many of these because they were really elaborate and just for a like 8-second visual joke. Are they in a museum somewhere? Like, what happens to these things? Or they
should be
them?
in a museum something. I'm often surprised how many things get saved. Like I had like my first year at Conan, I think I had an idea in a staring contest bit for Hamlet, who was played by Andy Daly, the great Andy Daly, by the way. But I had an idea for him to French kiss Hamlet, to French kiss the skull, but it required a tongue to come out of the skull. And it worked with a little switch. And our prop guy goes, "Yeah, no problem. I'll make a tongue come out of the skull." And on my last day at Conan, like 18 years later, he gave me that skull as a gift. And I'm like, "Are you telling me you've had this the whole time?" And it traveled to LA. And I'm like, "Why did you hang on to this?" But that makes me think that these things are probably in like a warehouse somewhere.
Wow. Well, I know that like SCTV, they worked with like Jules Hollemeyer as their wardrobe person, and they had pretty amazing makeup and hair people on a really limited budget. But does the character come to life when you start putting on that stuff? Like, do you change in the moment when all of a sudden, oh, this wig is a different color than I thought? It's going to change the trajectory of how I play this character.
That's a great question, Chris. It did always feel like it helped the costumes did help me get into character. That's for sure. Like when I put on the interrupter outfit, it was basically like a crazy musketeer, or Hannigan, the traveling salesman, who dressed like an old timey salesman, or the ghost crooner. There is something about it. And I often found this even in improv shows. You backstage, you throw on a pair of glasses, and it's easier to become a different person. Or you just, for me, having a hat or a wig, I tended to hide behind character costumes because, like, that's one of the reasons I could never imagine doing stand up. Being myself on stage, just standing there with a microphone, is unthinkable to me. Even though I admire stand ups with everything in me, I just could never imagine doing that. But I've always loved doing characters.
Many of your characters have a musical basis that is kind of tragic. You've got Artie Kendall, the ghost crooner. You got the heavy metal inappropriate guy.
Right.
What's the one that that Conan always hated your character? Brian LaFontaine? Is that the
basic cable name that tune guy?
Basic cable name that tune, and he was just like, I hate you. Like, you hated that character and you kept coming on and doing the songs, just these really elaborate things. Did you ever try to be in a band? Were you in a band? Did you have musical aspirations?
I love music so much and I revere it so much that I never had the guts to try playing in a band or playing music myself, but I've always uh it's I think it took me a long time to try comedy for the same reason actually because it was almost sacred to me. Like I was like I don't want to go in there and mess up something I love, like I don't want to like some people have that feeling of and I think that's probably rooted in my self-esteem issues and stuff, which shows up in a lot of my characters. But I think there's that feeling of like I love it. I couldn't imagine doing it, but I love it. And I still feel that way about music, but it took me a long time even to get up the courage to try comedy. And once I did, I wish I'd tried it years before because I loved it instantly. But I love, I have such a, I love the relationship between music and comedy too. So many of my favorite musicians love comedy or do comedy as like a side thing. Like my friend John Worster, who plays drums, with with Superchunk and everybody else, and Bob Mould and Robert Pollard and everybody else. John, it's almost unfair how funny he is because he's like, I think he's one of the funniest people in the world, and he's also an incredible drummer. But I think there's, I was always amazed at Conan or others at Stephen's show. A lot of times when musicians would bring up comedy bits to me, and a lot of times I'd realize that a lot of musicians are comedy nerds. Like like Jack White came up to Andy Blitz, who was one of our writers in the hallway, and he recognized him from a really obscure bit that he'd been in. And I just love that. And John Mayer brought up a really obscure sketch that we had done. And I was like, I can't believe they remembered that. It wasn't like an ongoing recurring bit. And it was oftentimes bits we loved, so I could tell that, and Neko Case, who's one of my favorite singer-songwriters, has an amazing sense of humor. I actually asked her to do the monologue at our improv show at Upright Citizens Brigade a couple times, and she was, of course, wonderful. And I knew she would be because I could tell how funny she was in concert. But it was fun. It was kind of endearing to see how nervous she was to step out of her comfort zone and do a comedy show. But she was great, and I knew she would be.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a newer thing in a weird way. When I was going to shows in the 80s, when you went to see Husker Du or REM, they weren't cracking jokes in between. Like there was not you didn't go see a band at an arena show and be like, Ozzy's really funny tonight. I feel like something happened in the indie underground.
Yeah.
Where they just all started kind of mashing together, because I think a lot of the lineups were weird too. You'd have 3 or 4 bands that weren't alike on something, and it allowed for some of these things to poke out. But now it's just like so many of the people, it's like there's no dead time in between a song. It's like people's banter is pretty high grade nowadays when you go to see a band.
That's so true. And I've often found too, it used to surprise me, but it doesn't anymore, that a lot of times the people who write the best sad songs are the funniest people. Guys, I don't know why that is, but like Dylan, John Lennon, just Paul Westerberg, people that they write the songs that tear your heart out. But and Nico too, people like that. And just I often find that I think it's that ability to see the gray areas in life, maybe, and the subtleties of life, and how a lot of my favorite comedy stuff has sadness in it or a kind of melancholy edge to it, like Billy Wilder's movies or shows like Party Down or Cheers, that there's often like or The Office, these shows that have like kind of a sadness underneath the main characters, even though the shows are hilarious.
Well, your characters have that too. None of them are on the upswing of something that they're part of. It's like they are kind of being weighted down by history or bad luck. And
Right.
I wanted to ask you about, because I was actually a little worried when I saw this when it came on in real time. When you did the Slipnutz sketch, which was, I believe Slipknot had been on Conan previously.
Right.
And then you 3 of you come out as the Slipnutz. slipping on nuts, and you have this like kind of vaudeville kind of song, and you're wearing these matching outfits, and then they make you open. Well, they don't make you, but it feels like it. All of a sudden, you're being forced to go on and open at an arena show for Slipknot.
Right.
And it is one of the greatest moments when they show the audience just their head just cracks open. They're not in on the joke. It's like there's totally humorless about it. I mean, were you nervous having to go and do that? Or were you like, this is going to be a train wreck. This is hilarious.
We weren't really sure how they would react, and they reacted exactly like we hoped they would. They were confused or angry.
Yes.
And we didn't want them to laugh. We wanted them to be like, what the, and the look on their face was just perfect because it's funny because right before we went on stage, the stage manager said, hey, be careful, guys. Sometimes these fans throw batteries at the bands they like.
Oh, my God.
We're like, oh, man. So we didn't know if we were going to get stuff thrown at us. I think they threw some cups, like beer cups and stuff. But and I wish Andy Blitz said we should have run out for an encore, like, which would have been hilarious, but we'd probably be dead. But it's funny because I didn't know at the time what the band thought of the bit. And we found out years later in an interview that John Glazer sent me that the lead singer of Slipknot actually found it really funny. And I think the band really enjoyed it. And that made me feel better because I was like, I didn't know if it was just the publicist letting us do it or what, but the band had a good sense of humor about it. And I got to say, even though I'm not a big metal guy, they put on an amazing show. Like they were just, the energy was incredible. They must lose like 10 pounds a show. Like it was just nonstop energy. It was a blast.
Some of my favorite shows have been like those big shows that I would not be at otherwise, but someone got me a ticket and I'm like, I don't know much about this band. And then it's just pure spectacle.
Yeah.
It's like fire and stage props and explosions. And
Right.
I just don't get to see that much. And so it is impressive when you see something that's just so calibrated to theater and music, on like a kind of a bigger budget than most things I get to access.
It's so true. And also you realize too, they were in character too, like a lot of our comedy sketches. Because like backstage at Conan, one of the sweetest things was the guy with the big scary metal mask. He comes off stage and he's massive. He looks like he could just kill two people with his bare hands. And he comes off stage and a little girl goes, Daddy, and goes running to him and he picks her up. And I'm like, oh, he's just a dad from Iowa who plays music, And it was really sweet to see. And it was just to realizing, oh, he's just doing a character too,
Right.
It was pretty adorable.
Well, what about the bands that play, like the band that is the house band on a late night show? It seems like they're always being drawn into doing like a musical comedy bit or stings. Is that something that they look forward to? Do they think that's really fun? It's probably like they have to learn their stuff as quick as you're doing it.
Yeah, we were lucky at Conan and at Stephen's show to have musicians that are such nice game people. Like they're usually up for, they just want to help make the show better. And if they can contribute to a bit, they're happy to do it. In my experience, I don't remember any of the musicians being reluctant to do bits. And we were lucky enough that they all had really great personalities. And like Louis Cato, who leads our band currently, is just a delightful guy, and he can sing in any genre. Like he can sing country song. Like if you want a bit where he's singing like Hank Williams Jr., he can do it. And they can play anything. They multi-instrumentalists, and we've been doing a bit called Band Ads recently, where we supposedly show fake commercials that the band members have been doing, and that's really fun. And they do a great job with it, and they seem to have fun doing it.
Well, you've picked Townes Van Zandt, this pretty intense film to talk about. Did you grow up listening to his music? Where did you first hear him? Because for me, I was really late to his music. I did not have friends growing up listening to this music. It came later. How was it for you?
Very similar. I grew up, a lot of, as you can see, even in the documentary, a lot of Townes Van Zandt's records in the 70s and 80s were out of print. You know, that he was really a true cult figure. And I think I kind of stumbled on it. I think one of my first introductions to him actually was through an absolutely gorgeous cover of Townes' song Rex's Blues that was done by Jay Farrar and Kelly Willis on a AIDS tribute album. It was like a AIDS charity rock uh, rock hot and bothered, I think is what it was called. It was like a indie rock charity album for a good cause, and they just did this. It was one of the most beautiful. I still think that cover of Rex's Blues by Farrar and Willis is one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard, and it's it's and then I think I had heard Pancho and Lefty, you know, over the years. Like my parents had Emmylou Harris's version of that, and I loved it, but I didn't think about who wrote it really. You know, I just thought, wow, that's a great song, and uh, and I think that if I needed you, I was familiar with, you know, from just the famous versions that were on the radio and things like that. But I discovered him later on and just sort of got deeper and deeper into his songs. And the album that I think really tore my head off when I finally heard it was Live at the Old Quarter, because it's just him and an acoustic guitar in a hot little bar in Houston. And it's so intimate, and there's no unnecessary production on it or anything. It's just him in the early 70s at his peak, just singing his heart out for a room with no air conditioning. And it's just this incredible, incredible document. It's still my favorite. That's what I would tell people to listen to first if they were going to listen to anything by him. But the soundtrack to Be Here to Love Me is amazing too, because it covers kind of his whole the range of his career. And but yeah, I think again, he's another guy who's obviously had a great sense of humor, and it comes out in the film, and also when he would talk conversationally, he had that kind of dry, sardonic wit. And but again, you know, writing the saddest songs in the world, but could make you laugh, you know, going out afterwards, you know, and
Yeah.
that's so true of so many of my favorite songwriters. John Prine, like that too. I mean, who writes better sad songs than John Prine? But he could make you laugh in the next song, just like, you know, Paul Westerberg can do too, or you know, just that ability to the dark and the light, you know, the mix.
Yeah. I mean, throughout the film, like, especially when the camera's on him, he's kind of a goofball.
Yeah.
You know, I hate to jump to the end of the film, but the end of the film is him just being a goofball and trying on different types of baseball hats and cowboy hats that he has lying around,
Yeah.
and then just smiling at the camera and then putting a different one on, and it just says the dumbest slogans on it. And it's like a 3-minute like performance piece, probably for like his kid who was filming it or something like that. He seemed to really like to cut up in a way that if you were, you know, the myth of his albums, you may not have gotten that. Some of his songs had funny material in it, but the overall feeling of it is this person wears their emotions on their sleeves as an artist.
Yeah, he really did. And it's remarkable too that the first song he ever wrote was Waiting Around to Die, which is one of the darkest songs you can imagine. Like his ex-wife talks in the movie about how she said he was writing her a song and she thought it was going to be this really sweet love song, and that's the first song he comes out with from this closet he's writing in. And she's like, just that's the first song he wrote like in his 20s is just it's like the fact that John Prine wrote Sam Stone when he was like 23. It blows my mind. Or Hello in There, you know, how did they it feels, those songs feel so lived in, like songs that you'd have to be 70 years old to write those songs. And I don't know how young men like that wrote those, but yeah, I think that you could tell though that he had a really fun sense of humor. Like I love when Steve Earle said Townes is the best songwriter in the world, and I'll stand on Bob Dylan's coffee table in my cowboy boots and say that. And then Townes's response was, I've met Bob Dylan's bodyguards, and if Steve thinks he can stand on his coffee table, he's sadly mistaken.
Right.
Which I love, you know, but I love that they and it was obviously how much an influence Townes had on people like Steve Earle. And like I love that Chris Christopherson in the documentary says Townes was a songwriter's songwriter. You know, he's a songwriter that other songwriters love, even if the wide public doesn't get to know him. Yeah, like I love that I saw a clip of Nora Jones, Gillian Welch, and David Rawlings doing Townes' song Loretta. It's on YouTube, and it's one of my favorite songs by Townes, Loretta. And they just do this incredible version of it. And I love that all these people know who he is, and all these people love him. And Laura Marling did his song on the Austin City Limits tribute, and every songwriters just have always loved him, just like they love John Prine.
But it's always kind of sad to me, and this comes up in a lot of music documentaries. It is a hindsight thing. They are a musician's musician, or they were a filmmaker's filmmaker, or an author's author, and
Mm-hmm.
like they didn't connect for some reason with the general public. I always feel bad when somebody is not appreciated in their time, and then afterwards people are like, oh my god, this is my favorite songwriter. It's something that just happens. Obviously it's going to happen forever in the continuum of art. It's hard to hear him on the phone being interviewed and basically be like, yeah, my albums don't sell, I don't really know what's going on. But I'm trying to write. I have a song that's all bird names, and the last line of it's going to be in Latin, and you're
Yeah.
like, he probably did do that.
Yeah, it is sad to me. Like I when I love an artist, I want them to be huge, and
Yes.
so many of my favorite bands and singer-songwriters over the years, I don't feel they've ever gotten the audience they deserve. I love them. Sometimes there's something that makes them even more lovable when I think about that. But I want them to have. I think they deserve all the success that they didn't get. And yeah, there if there were justice, a lot of those artists would have a lot more money in the bank.
Yeah, I mean, he was justifiably as good as any of the other artists who were kind of doing, you know, I guess the country underground, you would say, in a weird way. And that broke out of it, were like independent artists on smaller labels that then found an audience. And then in the 70s and just kind of bloomed from there and had a career
Hmm.
that could just, sustain them. But for some reason, I mean, obviously, he had demons too and
Hmm.
problems, but it seemed like often, that sometimes doesn't stand in the way of success for other people. They find a way to be heard.
Yeah, I think it's sad because I think sometimes it's the demons that bring out these brilliant songs in them because they're trying to almost exorcise the demons with the songs, but I don't think they ever really fully get rid of those demons. They write about them and shine a light on them for other people so they don't feel so alone. Like I always like that Lou Reed said, one of my goals in writing songs is so people out there won't feel alone. And the Velvet Underground, another band, obviously that that the old joke they sold 10,000 records, but everybody that bought one formed a band. The Stooges were the same way. They didn't sell any records, and I mean, who and now they're considered gods of godfathers of punk, and rightfully so.
Well, it's so funny. Even the Replacements, which you've mentioned a
Yeah,
couple times, reading Trouble Boys about the Replacements, it's amazing how little Tim sold, under
yeah,
50,000 copies. And you're like, how is that possible? They were on Sire. Everybody I knew had that record. But then you break it down and you're like, well, maybe every major city they were playing like 2,000 people in. And you add
yeah,
that up and you're like, and then you go 10 miles outside of that city, nobody knows who they are. And they're
yeah,
preaching to the converted. It's the same 2,000 people. It's just a weird thing to wrap my head around sometimes because I was, bands like Pavement, I was like, oh, they're the biggest band in the world to me,
yeah,
and then you realize like, oh, like it was it wasn't that big as I thought.
yeah. A lot of my favorite artists, I always assume they're wealthier and better known than they are, and like I'm
Hmm.
often shocked when I hear even Aimee Mann, I heard her in an interview say, I basically break even on tour if I'm lucky. And I'm just like,
Amazing.
Aimee Mann,
Right.
and who's another songwriter, and
Right.
sure she has she's popular, but it's all relative, and it's like the and these days too, with in the age of streaming and everything, it breaks my heart to see how little artists get for the music they're putting out there, from streaming services and things like that. They deserve so much more.
Are you a lyric or a music person first?
That's a good question. I love both, and I love how they complement each other. Uh, but a lot of my favorite artists are great lyricists, Joni Mitchell and Nico and Forsberg and people like Townsend, even like people like Freedy Johnston, another underappreciated guy, or Dave Alvin. These guys who I think
Yep.
took a lot of influence from people like Towns, I think. But they're almost like great story writers. They're great short story writers. Or Roseanne Cash has songs like that are they conjure up these characters the way a great Flannery O'Connor story does. Where they're just so vivid. And I was happy to see Dave Alvin get an Americana Lifetime Achievement Award recently, because I'm like, I've always loved his songs, and I just think he deserves so much more recognition too. But Freedy Johnson, you never hear people really talk about him, and I think he's written some songs that absolutely floor me.
Yeah, I saw him play a private birthday party not long ago. It was like,
Wow.
yeah, but everybody there seemed to know who he was, right?
Oh, good. That's
But
great.
but at this, and he was cool. And then, maybe in another country or a different part of the states, they're like massive. It is weird. Being a musician. I mean, well, I'm sure being a comedian is weird too. I think just being artistic it's just like, it's such a weird, there's so much to talk about. There's such a spectrum. And it's so funny that the one of his albums is the late great Townes Van Zandt.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I thought of you when I think of that record and you picked this. It seemed like a title you would come up with. If you had your own record, what would you call it?
Oh God, I can't even imagine. It's so hard to imagine, because I've always again, it's like a world that I've imagined and fantasized about being part of. Like, the only thing that comes up is something like Awkward Thunder, like
That's awesome.
like
Awkward Thunder out on Atlantic Records.
it doesn't even mean anything. That sounds like almost like a parody, like a Spinal Tap type album, which is I think I automatically go to the cartoony character version of things.
I don't
But
know. It could be a glam rock record. Could be like a real psychedelic country record. I don't
yeah,
know. I think
my,
I would trademark that, because I think people who hear this, there's going to be a band or a solo album within 2 months of this, and we'll be able to buy it. So
oh, I'd be honored. So yeah, I encourage any young fans out there to use that name if you so choose. It's funny when you mentioned about being in other countries, though, like how I'm always so pleasantly happy and surprised to hear when someone has a big following overseas. Like on my honeymoon in '96, my wife and I went to see John Prine at a little in Galway, Ireland, and we figured he'd be playing in a little pub,
right.
and he was playing to a huge crowd. And I was like, oh, he has this huge following over here that's bigger than his following in America. That's wonderful. Or the Ramones would talk about how they could go down to Brazil and play a football
Oh yeah.
stadium, and then they'd come back to New Jersey and play a little club and half fill it. And that's really crazy to me. But it's always nice to hear when people have a following somewhere, that they can a passionate following.
Well, the film is really beautifully made. It has new interviews with people like, Guy and Suzanne Clark, Kevin Eggers, his label owner, who was the first person who kind of put his stuff out. I wanted to ask you, in this film, his headquarters are located in the Chelsea Hotel, right?
Yeah.
And that has such a storied history. I'm sure it's changed now. I think it's like a boutique type hotel. But it's so weird to see somebody actually having an apartment in the
Yeah.
Chelsea. Like, this is where I live every day. Did you ever get to go there, or do you know much about the history of that? Because that just seems counterproductive in terms of being able to even put out music by an artist from like an apartment like that, or a hotel room.
That's such a good point. I've always been fascinated by the Chelsea, just from the mythology and
Hmm.
people like Dylan Thomas. Like, I think it's where Dylan Thomas was living when he passed away, and people like Edie Sedgwick and the Warhol crowd. And
Arthur C. Clarke wrote 2001
oh, I
there.
didn't even know that.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
But just like I went in once kind of as a like a pilgrimage before I even lived in New York and just walked
Uh-huh.
into the lobby when I was visiting New York in like 94 or something. I just had to see it. And I went in when it was still kind of a shabby bohemian hotel. I think it's been converted into kind of luxury condos, like so much of New York
Yeah.
has been gentrified and stuff. I could be wrong about that, but I think it has been. But the only time I walked into the lobby was, yeah, about 30 years ago. And it was, and I'm glad I walked into CBGB's when it was still CBGB's just to see what it looked like.
Right.
That was around 1990. I think I walked in there just to see it in the middle of the day. And that's like a high end designer shoe store now, which really is very depressing. Just like Max's Kansas City is now a deli,
Yeah.
which I heard Patti Smith cried when she saw it, and I don't blame her, especially if you were ever in there during its glory days, you know?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's tragic. I mean, the film is filled with people like Kevin Akers, trying to support this artist and getting things off the ground. But then there's, like a lot of stories about artists, a lot of tragedy in terms of his mental health and the type of what was available of care at the time for what their concerns were for him mentally, were really
Yeah,
misplaced. And so like loss of memory, which is amazing because his lyrics are so dense that he
yeah.
could he could recall that. It felt like people had his back, I guess is what I'm saying. Like there were so many people who
Hmm.
wanted the best for him and really wanted to lift him up or make one of his songs well known on the radio so he could get a little publishing money and things like that. But it also seemed like it was a split between what he was able to do and what he really wanted to do. And, it kind of culminated with Kevin Eggers recording this album that wasn't released till way later, but they just couldn't afford the studio time. So basically, the person
Hmm.
just held on to the tapes, and that was that. So it just
Yeah,
seemed like there was a lot going against him as well. And some of it he couldn't help. It was just in his DNA. The film really, you get to see a really hard look at somebody who is very self aware of the place they're in.
absolutely. And to tell you the truth, I'm a little surprised the film was even made because of first of all the fact that he is a bit of a cult figure and that it is often such dark subject matter. And I'm so grateful that it was made. Just like I'm so grateful that Ethan Hawke made that movie Blaze about Blaze Foley. You know, these figures that whose music I love. I love Blaze Foley songs, especially Clay Pigeons and If I Could Only Fly, you know, songs like that. They're just masterpieces, I think. And but these guys were often their own worst enemies, you know, in terms of their self-destructive tendencies. And I relate to the self-medication stuff, you know, as someone who's dealt with uh, you know, being kind of a melancholy guy myself. And, you know, I know where a lot of that comes from. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons I connected to the song so much. You know, there's the kind of melancholy Irish guy I am. You know, there's something in the kind of the storytelling and how heartfelt but often beautifully sad it is.
And the amazing thing about the film, too, is considering he was such a cult figure, the majority of the film is Townes telling you his story. It's Townes telling you about
Mm-hmm.
how he was into glue sniffing when he was a teenager. It's Townes telling about the time he thought he could lean out a window just to see how far he could go and see what it felt like to fall. It's
Yeah.
Townes telling about the highs and lows, um, and that's kind of unique in a film like this, that it's not full of talking heads, um, being like, "Oh, he was great," or "This was tragic." It's kind of Townes setting the tone for a lot of this film.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just the way they intersperse the interviews with him, it really does set the tone. And I think you feel like you get a pretty complete picture of him, even though he wasn't a very well documented guy. You know, you get, I think, the insights from other songwriters and from people who loved him, including his wives, you know, two of them anyway.
Yeah.
and they obviously, it was obviously a complicated relationship a lot of times for them. Like his son, JT talking about how heartbreaking it was and how messed up his dad was when he went to go visit him when he was a kid, um,
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
and also just how his last wife, mentioned when she first met him, she looked up and she said she heard a voice in her head saying, "It's him." Like he's the one, he's the guy for you. And she's like, "Oh, please don't make it be him." Which I found very funny because she's like, but there was something about towns where you're in trouble, but you're drawn to him anyway. Because there was something his sister says in the movie, how everyone's family has at least one child that can get away with murder because of who they are, and that was Towns, and their family, and they're so charming and so charismatic that sometimes they get away with stuff other people can't get away with.
He has a complicated relationship with his kids too, because he was kind of all in the mythology of, like, I have to put everything into this to remain an artist. And there's a quote that his son JT, who looks so much like him. I don't think I've ever seen anyone look so much like their father before. And he said, on one hand, I think it's a real brave move to put everything aside and pursue the one thing you're just mad about. But on the other hand, if you're personally susceptible to addiction, then it's a real good excuse and it feeds into your addiction. And that's actually kind of a weak move, to kind of cast everything aside and just do the one thing, because obviously in this world you have people who care about you, and there's too many other things in your life besides writing songs that are important.
That was really moving. Yeah. Yeah.
And his other son being like, I have to listen to his songs to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, I never listened to his music when I was younger, but now as an young adult, that's what I do. And then his youngest daughter, who just has vague memories of her father because she was just kind of an infant. But yeah, it's really, it's painful because this is somebody who wanted home and wanted some sense of like stability, but what was being asked of him was probably like the least stable thing he could do. And the film documents a lot of like so there's some pretty rough shows in it at some point where his band members are like, he'd sing like a line, then he'd stop. And then like 13 minutes later, we're kind of just doing all instrumentals,
Yeah. I think there's among some of my favorite artists, going back to the Replacements too, there's this self-destructive streak, or a kind of shoot yourself in the foot streak with some of my favorite artists. Like the fact that the Replacements would sometimes play an entire show where they didn't play any of their own songs, and they would play songs they hadn't even rehearsed, like Leonard Skinner covers or whatever, or country covers, or just to see what they could get away with. And on the one hand, it's hilarious, and I think I find that very endearing in a lot of ways, that people just not taking themselves seriously like that. But it also, I think, keeps them from being as big as they could be. So you're a little bit frustrated at the same time, where you're like, oh, like, these guys, Blaze Foley was the same way. Like in the movie Blaze, he gets a chance to showcase himself in front of industry people and completely melts down. And know, at their best, like Guy Clark says of Towns in the movie, there were nights where he saw him and he was just perfect, letter perfect, like field hippie high, running through a field kind of feeling to watching him. And I know that with the great artists, if you catch them on those nights, you know what they're capable of. And when they don't deliver that, it can be a little frustrating, because you're like, I want you to be huge. I want everyone to see you at your best, but we're not always at our best, obviously.
Well, that's got to be a through line in comedy too, right?
Absolutely. I think some of my favorite comedic artists, were often their own worst enemies, like I think that, or could have been bigger than they were if they were I always think of, there's a movie, A Thousand Clowns, with Jason Robards, and his character reminds me a lot of my favorite comedians who get in their own way because they're so pure, and it's one of the things you admire about them, because they're so true to themselves and so true to their art, and they don't compromise at all, and they can't compromise. It's like Martin Balsam, who plays his brother in the movie, says, I'm not like you. I have the gift of surrender. And I think a lot of musicians don't have the gift of surrender, and they're oftentimes the greatest artists, but they can't compromise. They can't play the game. They can't play the industry game, and it keeps them from being as big as they could be. But it's also one of the things I admire about them too.
Right.
So it's a contradiction there.
Well, it's kind of amazing, watching this film, how long Townes did work for. He did put out albums occasionally, here and there, and did try to perform a lot. And you can hear his voice changing on some of the,
Mm-hmm.
mid-period records. It's getting a little croaky. But then
Yes.
the second or third song might be the most soaring thing you've heard him do. It's really
Yeah.
an odd experience listening to those mid-period, late-period records, because often you're like, oh yeah, it's just not all there. But there's always a few songs on each record that are just incredibly gorgeous, and he's singing almost better than you've heard him sing before. It's really odd. His records, I find, um, to be a kind of an interesting experience. They're not always entirely consistent.
Yeah, you're right. Because at times he would sound, it's almost like when you hear like a Billie Holiday album, Lady in Satin, which is a lot of people's favorite Billie Holiday album, but her voice is clearly ravaged, but it still sounds so real. And it sounds so like she's been through some stuff, and it adds a level of textures to the songs that some people, it's so vulnerable and real. And some of those Towns albums, even when his voice gets very croaky and whiskey soaked, and it's had so much smoke and whiskey on it, that it's gonna sound like that. But even like he has a song during that croaky period called "Many a Fine Lady." I don't know if you've heard that one, but just lines like her words like a mountain stood lonely and lofty, with her face like a daydream and her hair like a shawl, worn by a mourner who steals away softly from those that would have him mourn nothing at all. You know, just to be able to write lines like that. That's
That's
like
amazing.
that's those are lines that I think Dylan would be proud to write. I think it it's dark. It's some of the best. I think he's at his best, as good as anyone. You know.
Yeah. And allegedly, Dylan and him had an interesting kind of relationship. Dylan really wanted, to do songs by him or something, but it just never came to be. But yeah, that would have been kind of amazing to see the two of them do something either way, like either Dylan feeding him something or vice versa. But yeah, I'm so jealous as somebody who struggles with lyrics. Um, I'm always envious of things that just are just so, it just seems effortless. I mean, he wrote hundreds of songs with amazing, powerful lyrics, and had just a way to do it. And I don't know. And again, maybe there's a parallel in comedy, because I always wonder, like, yeah, people got to hit the wall with that too. Like, do you hit the wall in terms of ideas and the expectations, because you have to do it nightly?
Yeah, there are times where you have to kind of come to terms with the fact that some days you're just not as inspired as other days. And I often think of Joni Mitchell saying, she would sit down at the piano, and some nights her muse would say, "You can't have it tonight." you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
I, I'm not giving you anything. And that's Joni Mitchell, the great genius.
right.
And I remember Peter Buck from REM saying that they would get together every day and play, and some days nothing would happen. But it's the getting together that's the victory, because other days they would write 5 songs. You never know when it's going to come and when the magic's going to
Right.
strike. And so I think it's being ready for the inspiration, and just like, and also recognizing that it's very mysterious. I always loved how Dylan, on 60 Minutes, they were asking him about his early songs, and he was talking about "It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding," and he said, he starts rattling off the lyrics, and he goes, I I don't know where that came from, and I couldn't write it today. Like he doesn't know where it came. It's very mysterious to a lot of these people, and I think these artists, a lot the best ones anyway, they they can't really explain where these things come from. It's like they're just gifted with this kind of connection to the divine or something.
As a fan of your work, and again, like I said, you're one of the my favorite long form running weirdos on TV, right?
Thank
Up
you,
there
Chris.
with Chris Elliott and the
Oh,
people, that that meant so much to me. Is it surprise you too, where like your ideas come from? Because to me, it's the same thing. I'm like, where did that come from? Like, how in the hell did you grab that? It's just been there, but by the time you see it, it makes total sense, but it's just, I don't know. I'm in awe of people who can do as much as you've done and still be at such a high level in terms of just the concepts just never end.
well, thank you so much for saying that. That means so much to me, especially to hear Chris Elliott's name tossed in there because he was one of the guys that made me want to do this. I used to watch him on Letterman, and I got to meet him really briefly working on a little show called Eagle Heart that a couple of my friends created from Conan.
Oh my
And
gosh. Incredible
oh, I'm
series.
so glad you saw it.
Oh, I'm obsessed. One of the first things I bought on eBay was it was like a 9 or 10 VHS cassette thing of every single moment Chris Elliott appeared on David Letterman.
Oh, wow.
Whether it was him standing in the Museum of Hard to Believe in the corner, not saying anything, to then just him starting to kind of be the guy under the seat, the regulator guy, and just the Chris Elliott Jr. show and on and on. And I was like, I have them all. This is before the internet, right? And I'm like,
wow.
before you could stream them on YouTube. And I was like, I have everything chronologically. So I've always had a really special place in my heart. And I feel like it's a small party you're part of. I feel like there are a lot of people who do sketch and things like that. But what you do and what Chris did is just like, it speaks to me as a fellow weirdo. So thank you.
Oh God, that means so much. Thank you so much. And yeah, Chris Elliott stuff, I felt the same way about it. And just to get to meet him, and they say don't meet your heroes, but he was just
Right.
he was as nice as he is brilliant, and that was such a pleasant thing to see. I was so afraid, what if he turns out to be a jerk? I didn't think he would be, but he was the best, and just as sweet as could be. And it's nice when you meet people like Fred Willard, turned out to be another guy I was lucky enough to meet in LA,
Oh
who's
God.
I admired since I was a kid, and he's the nicest guy in the world. And that's such a treat to
Uh,
meet people like that.
but it's so funny. Like you talk about Chris Elliott. I was like cheering for Daddy's Boy to be on the top one, most read books. So, it's like it's for nobody, right? They're making this art that's so for such a limited audience. I saw Cabin Boy the opening day. It came out at the theater. One of the few times where I've just seen people walk out. They're just like, I'm done. I'm tapping out. And it wasn't for everyone. So, yeah, I feel like, I, I'm not trying to compare Chris Elliott to Townes Van Zandt, but what I'm saying is I just have a respect for people who kind of they're themselves through and through, and they just can't help but to just keep making stuff that just is a pure extension of them, whether it's, tragedy or, comedy. So.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I know some artists like will say, if I knew if like I always find it kind of endearing when some artists will say, if I knew how to sell out, I would. Like,
Right.
I don't know how to do anything but what I do. And I like when
Yes.
they're that honest about it. Like some wouldn't, but others I like when they kind of say, if I knew how to write a commercial hit, I would do it. This is just what I do, and I have no choice,
Yes.
and I always admire that kind of honesty.
Yeah. I just saw the new Pavement documentary, Pavements. And at a certain point, every interview with them is, you guys don't seem to want to be successful or you don't want to be big. And they're like, yeah, we do. It's just we're Pavement and our music. You seem to think that we're going to be the next Nirvana. We don't think we're going to be the next Nirvana. Have you heard our music? Have you seen us live? Like, we're not that. So, like, we're doing everything we can to be successful. But it was amazing. It was just a running theme through it. And yeah, it is kind of amazing to think how the things that you love, you want to last forever.
Yeah, and it's funny too because to me, I remember Legs McNeil saying when he first heard the Ramones, he said, "This sounds like top 40 radio to me."
Sure.
And he was kind of baffled that the rest of the world said, "No,
I know.
that's not top 40 radio." Or like Guided by Voices, brilliant pop songs, just
Yeah.
top. They sound like some of them really do sound like top 40. In fact, I remember hearing songs like Quality of Armor, and I'm like, if Green Day did this, it would be a number one hit.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, and I don't know why it's not a number one hit by them too. And and I've heard Not a Surf songs like that or Fountains of Wayne songs where I'm like, these sound like number one hits to me, like just the way people felt about Big Star when they heard it. They're like,
Yeah.
this is just, this is, yeah, they sound like they should be platinum records. Yeah, to
Yeah.
me, they always will.
It's always going to be a story that just goes on and on in terms of, yeah, the things that we're going to shake our heads and be like, how did this not connect with people? I was kind of amazed that I never thought there'd be a direct line between the Crucifix and Townes Van Zandt, but Steve Shelley from Sonic Youth, who was in the Crucifix, ended up asking Townes to come out and make a record in Memphis at Easley Studios, which as a geek, I was a big fan of music coming out of Easley, but I had never seen any documentation of what it looked like. So it was really, as a music nerd, kind of fun to see, oh, like this totally looks different than I thought in terms of how I built up what this, mythical place was in the 90s. And it just couldn't get it off the ground. Townes was not in any shape to make the record, and was in a lot of pain and had a seizure. And at some point they just had to be like, we got to send you home. And it was a big regret of Townes. He really wanted to make that record. And it would have been kind of incredible if that world had aligned a little more and things had been different. It'd been kind of I think it could have been a really, like maybe one of those albums that cracked open the world a little bit more to him. I think it could have been a moment.
I think so too. And I often think about how like Rick Rubin revitalized Johnny Cash's career with American Recordings by just letting him be himself. But Johnny Cash was well enough at that point to let himself shine, and Rick Rubin was able to kind of just turn the recorder on and capture that. And I wish Townes could have done that too. He just wasn't in a place to do it, I guess, at the time. But I love when, people want to work with, like, I love finding out that Butch Vig loved Freddie Johnston and had him produce his second record because he fell in love with his songwriting. Here's a guy working with Nirvana and the Smashing Pumpkins. And he's like, yeah, but I love this guy's songs, and I want to work with him. And that's always really nice to hear, like when artists from one genre love music by another genre. It used to surprise me, like when I found out Led Zeppelin loved Joni Mitchell. I'm like, what? And but they just love good music. They've got good taste.
Yeah, that's it. It's good taste, and the people that are in the film that surround Townes' story, they just love him. And, there's a lot of footage from the film Heartworn Highways in this film, which was a 70s outlaw country documentary. I'm really glad they had access to that because that was the first time I had kind of seen Townes and kind of figured out who he was. Because for me growing up, country was kind of not like a good word to me, country music. Like in the 80s,
I get it.
It was like, these are shit kickers who don't like anything I represent. And then years later, just being like, oh my God, I totally missed out on this amazing genre. And these guys were punks. And, a lot of them were anti-war and, just really laying things bare in a way that like, I was like, oh, I'm getting all of my messaging from the Minutemen. And I'm like, well, I think they're closer than I thought in a way with their lyrics.
Yeah, there's a lot of I was a little prejudiced towards a lot of mainstream slick country, and I still am, to be honest. I get kind of snobby about it sometimes. But I love when you get down to, like, I always think of, I saw a thing on Charlie Parker, I think it was on American Masters, and he was putting music in the jukebox at a little dive bar, and he was playing country songs. And one of the guys in his band was like, Bird, what are you playing, this corny country songs? And Charlie Parker said, "Listen to the stories, man." And he was connecting to the music. He could jump into a
Right.
different genre and appreciate it. Or Ray Charles wanting to do a country album, a album of country songs, or like Neko Case coming out of country but playing rock, and like Waxahachie is one of my favorite current artists, Katie Crutchfield, and
Yeah.
I've seen her a couple times in concert, and she said her favorite songwriter is Lucinda Williams, and I love that. But a lot of Waxahachie's early stuff doesn't sound country at all, and a lot of Nico stuff doesn't
Right.
sound country, but they can do it as well as anyone. And the Stones did country brilliantly. "Torn and Frayed" is one of my favorite Stones songs.
Oh, it's what do we call it? Because I'm in a Rolling Stones coven, and we call it Jaggleish. When Jagger puts on a different accent
Oh, I
and
like
he
that.
starts doing his American, like, I was down in rodeo. You're like, oh, he's doing Jaggleish.
Oh, like,
It's his own version of the South, because it's so funny when they do country songs, they lay thick the accent, the American Southern accent. It's like, but you're so used to it that it's like, yeah, Dear Doctor. Yeah, here we go.
yeah, and then he takes it really far on Faraway Eyes, which is like
Oh,
almost,
so great.
yeah, it's almost like a
On the radio.
"Dear Bakersfield."
Oh, it's so good. Well, if I can spread a word, I think people should use Jaggleish freely, and I give that to the public now. It's been a private thing for 20 years, but now it's come out.
I like that. That should go in the dictionary with y'alternative, which I remember Mac McCown from Superchunk used that, and I was like, he said he didn't invent it, but I think it covers things like Sunvolt, a lot of my favorite bands, like that.
Yeah.
It's alternative, but it's also kind of country, and yeah.
Brian, thank you so much for being on here and talking about Townsend Zandt and your experiences. As a fan, I really appreciate it. It was really fun for me to get to know a bit more about how this all works. So at the end of every interview, I ask the same question, but I tailor it depending on the film we're talking about. So on a scale from 1 to 90, with 1 being the lowest and 90 being the highest, how many minutes with your eyes closed listening to Townes Van Zandt would you give this film? 1 minute of eyes closed to 90 minutes of eyes closed.
I'd say I'd go the full 90.
Yeah, that's what I have here. It's right. That's
Oh,
that's the correct answer. Yeah,
Oh,
90.
good.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I think I'm so glad the film was made. I think it's a great tribute. I don't think it shies away from the dark stuff, but I think it also shows what made him a great artist and what made him such an influence on other songwriters, like how Joe Ely, at the beginning, talks about picking him up when he was hitchhiking, and just how he taught him what a song is just from giving him a free album. And the guy brought it home and played it, and it was like, oh, this changed my whole idea of what a song could be.
Yeah. It's filled with amazing stories like that, where he'll be like, I wrote a new song, but I lost most of the pages.
Right.
It's like, it's just, there's something, and you believe it. This is myth building, obviously, but you're like, knowing the character of Townes, you're like, this happened.
Yeah, or like he said, he dreamed If I Needed You, and wrote it down when he woke up. And I 100% believe that he did, because he said he changed one line, which I think is hilarious. I don't know what the line was, but just the idea that he woke up, he dreamed he was a folk singer, not himself, and that's the song he sang in his dream, and he woke up and wrote it down, and it's his biggest hit. Maybe that and Pancho and Lefty, but that's just amazing. That's like one of those hits.
Yeah, it's a beautiful film and a great tribute. I'm so glad you picked it. It was so good to meet you, Brian. I really appreciate it so much.
I really love talking with you, Chris. Thanks so much for all the great music, and thanks for having me on your show. This was a real treat for me.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday on your favorite podcast app and additional bonus episodes every Sunday on our Patreon. The show's a completely independent affair, so the best way to support the show is through our Patreon at patreon.com/revolutionspermovie, where you can get weekly bonus episodes and shows, exclusive limited edition flexi discs and records and CDs featuring guests that have appeared on the show, and other exclusive goods sent to you just for joining. You can follow us on social media at Revolutions Per Movie and also find out more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye!